Now, I mentioned before that I don't just want to make sure that I can remove items from there, but instead, if I add an item to that Dreams location list, I want to update the list down there in the available locations, and I want to remove the item, which I just added here, from that list down here. And vice versa. If I then delete it from up here, it should be re-added to that list at the bottom. So how can we achieve this behavior? Well, you could definitely come up with different solutions, but one way of implementing this functionality would be to perform an out-of-band swap. And what's that now? An out-of-band swap is a technique you can apply with HTMX that allows you to return multiple HTML fragments in your response that are marked to target different places in the DOM. So instead of returning just one fragment or one HTML structure, which then is used to swap some part of the website that is defined with help of hxtarget and hxswap, instead of just doing that, you can use this out-of-band swap functionality to return multiple fragments for multiple targets. And here's how that works. Let's start in that post route here. Here, I first of all want to determine the available locations after adding a location to the interesting locations. And I can do that with help of this logic I have up here in the root route. I can indeed just copy this available locations constant down here into this post route. With that done, I'll cut this code here, this render location code, and I'll instead return a string in here in my response where I inject this rendered location. So this list item, that's the part with which I start my response content. But thereafter, I'll add some extra content, which is then not meant to be used to replace this target here, where the post request was sent, but which instead should perform such an out-of-band swap. And in my case here, I want to return an unordered list. To be precise, I want to return this available locations unordered list. And therefore, indeed, we can copy that. And it's important that you copy the available locations list, not the interesting locations list, because it's the available locations list I want to update here. I'll copy that and return that here as that second piece of content in my response in this post route. Now, right now, this would still all be treated as one response, so to say, one piece of content, and it would be this entire piece of content, so this list item and this list, that would be swapped in for this targeted location, so for this interesting locations list. And that's of course not what I want here. I only want to swap in this first element into this interesting locations list, and this second element here, this available locations list, should instead replace the existing available locations list that's already on the screen, on the page. And we can achieve this by adding a special attribute to this unordered list in this response here. And that's the hx-swap-OOB for out-of-band attribute. And you can set this to true to tell HTMX that this part of the response body should actually not be used to replace this target in the place where the request was sent, but that instead HTMX should look for an element with that ID, because it's that ID by which HTMX identifies these out-of-band swap targets. And if HTMX finds an element with that ID on the page, it will replace that element with this element here. Now, if for some reason you can't or don't want to use an ID for this out-of-band swap, you can also, instead of true, specify a CSS selector here. And you can also add swap settings like before and. The default here indeed is outer HTML, so the existing element will entirely be replaced with this element. But you could change this to before end or any other swap value. So any other value you could also set on hx swap. And then separated by a colon, you could specify a CSS selector that identifies the element that should be replaced with this part of the response body. So for example, the first unordered list that is found. But I don't need that here. Instead here I'll just set this to true, which means I want the default behavior, which means that HTMX will look for an element with this ID and will then entirely replace it. And that allows me to now return 2 elements in this response content that will be rendered in different parts of the page DOM. And therefore, with this adjustment made, if I now save that and I reload, you'll see that if I add this item here, it disappears from this list at the bottom. And that happens for every item I add here to the top list. Now, of course, if I delete items, they are not re-added though. This list down here is not updated. And that's, of course, not how it should work. So that's something we'll have to implement.